Alright, gentlemen, here we go. I'm going to go through this stuff pretty quickly because it seemed like everybody kind of understood what was going on, but some of you have asked me for a notes video, so here goes. I refer to John as John the Mystic because John's writing is mystical in a sense um, that you'll come to understand, hopefully, through the unit. Um, but anyway, it's important to distinguish him from the other gospel writers because his gospel is quite different, even if the big message is exactly the same. So that's really the goal of this unit, is to be able to use the definition of a gospel that we got together in our unit about the Gospel of Mark, to be able to use our knowledge of audiences that we got in the previous unit, and to be able to use our added knowledge of John to do the very best job we can interpreting his gospel. John is writing for a philosophically and theologically literate audience. What does that mean? What it means is they were very smart, they were very educated, they were very concerned about philosophy and about theology. And so he has to preach the Christian message in such a way that it makes sense to people like that. What's critical about philosophical type people is that words need to be very, very clearly defined. If you use the term God, for example, and one person's thinking of one thing and the other's thinking of something else, then the whole conversation will be meaningless. So, if you think about it, the example that you guys would know best would be the is a hot dog a sandwich debate. Well, as it turns out, when you define hot dog clearly, and define sandwich clearly, and maybe define the term is clearly, there's no debate to be had anymore. Once you have terms clearly defined, you have the answers. You can disagree about the definition of terms all day, but you can't really disagree very much once you share your terminology. So what we're going to see is that John presents a clear definition of who God is, what God is in a certain sense, who Jesus is, how they relate, and how they're all relevant to our lives. And as such, John actually does a really good job of getting over people's doubts about Christianity by simply showing that most of them are actually misunderstandings. So here goes. We started out by taking a look at a few of my favorite anti-God arguments. The first, the problem of evil, right? If there's an all-powerful God, why is there evil? Well, John's going to respond to that, as we'll see, by defining the term God in a very specific way and asking us what we mean by all-powerful. Pretty straightforward. How can there be an old guy on a cloud? Well, again, that gets to our definition of God, right? Not everybody who believes in God believes that there is an old man on a cloud. And little hint here, John certainly doesn't believe in the old man on the cloud. If evolution is real, God must be fake. Well, that's an interesting one, because that assumes a lot about how we understand God's creation. If you take the Bible very literally, rather than as stories that try to express a very complex reality, then yeah, you're going to have difficulty there. You won't be surprised to learn John actually will not. Religion wouldn't cause wars if God were real. Well, that's an interesting one too, isn't it? It's a compelling argument. If God is all-powerful, how do his followers do horrible things? Which they certainly do. Well, the short answer to that is, again, define what you mean by the term God, and you might end up solving that problem. Obviously, if we mean the old guy on the cloud who can control us all like we're in a dollhouse, that's a problem. If not, maybe not. The last one there is from one of my Turkish students when I taught over there, who said, well, the astronauts didn't find God, so of course that means God doesn't exist. Well, that's an interesting one. So again, if we are talking about Zeus and Poseidon and all of them sitting on top of Mount Olympus, in a physical location where one would be able to find them, then yeah, the astronauts really blew a big hole in this whole religion thing. If we're not, maybe they didn't. So here we go. John's got a super well-educated audience. Philosophers, well-educated people, often really like to get in discussions or debates. The very things that are rudest to do in society at large, force somebody to carefully think about what they've said, argue about the definition of a term, argue about politics and religion, these are all things that philosopher types often really like to do. Right? So they engage in friendly dialogues. John is trying to contribute to one of those friendly dialogues. And so he has to define his terms very carefully. Among those terms are God, Jesus, all-powerful, all-knowing, and omnipresent, which means unending, basically. He is everywhere and in all times and places. So we have to think about what he's dealing with. He's dealing with an audience with questions about God. In case you don't know, this is God in South Park. Very few atheists exist in the ancient world, but this audience does still have a lot of questions about what you mean when you talk about God. They have questions about what you mean when you talk about the Messiah also, right? And so John has to be incredibly clear about what exactly he means when he's talking about God, Christ, all-powerful, all those other terms, so that having established his firm theology, his clear theology, he can respond to people who have different worldviews. Now again, John is not responding to atheists, but as a result of the fact that he is responding to intellectuals who have questions, critical questions about the faith, he actually provides the best response of the four Gospels to modern atheistic outlooks. So here's his task. Define everything very, very clearly so that he can go on to establish that Christianity is in fact an intelligent, sophisticated, and philosophical school of thought. In other words, to make sure that he establishes that you're allowed to disagree with Christianity, certainly, right? You can disagree with any philosophy, but that to disagree on the grounds that it's too stupid to believe is just irresponsible. Hopefully that makes sense. John and his followers are credited with having written 5 of the New Testament's books: the Gospel of John, the 3 letters of John, and the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation. All of these obviously are written by different guys, but they all come together to establish the same argument, to establish the same definition for the term God, and to build from there. John's definition in all 5 of those works is that God is love itself. So shall we say, if you remember our discussions of Plato, the Platonic form of love. Okay? God is love perfected. He is the ideal version of love, basically, that all other love reflects imperfectly. Jesus is that love showing itself into the world. So if you remember when we briefly discussed Plato, we said the form of the perfect circle, the ideal form of the perfect circle, doesn't exist as part of our experienced reality, but does exist in some respect. Jesus is God breaking that rule and existing in our reality so that we can come to know the truest reality, which is love itself. When we say God is love, we don't just mean that God loves, but that God is in fact love. So when I say I believe in God, what I'm saying is that love is an actual part of the universe. When I say that God created, I am saying that love is the reason there is something and not nothing. That love needed to be experienced, right? That the reason why all of these natural processes occurred was to create, basically, to lead to human beings and other species of, similar intellectual ability, perhaps on other planets, that are capable of understanding love, of experiencing it and knowing what it is, and of loving themselves too, loving themselves and others. So all of that is basically what John is saying. God and love are the same thing. So if Jesus says, you need to come to my Father in order to be saved, he means you need to be a loving person in order to live a good life. Okay? And that's really John's whole deal. And he builds everything else from there. We had a brief discussion about, well, do you think that love is a real thing or just a chemical reaction in the brain? Right? If it is just a chemical reaction, that means it would stop when we die. Christianity, starting with Jesus, but really in a very clear way articulated for the first time in John, preaches that love is in fact a real thing that exists beyond us, that we participate in, but which is greater than us. In other words, when we go from one place or time to the next, when we die, when we come to life, whatever, all of this kind of stuff, we participate in the reality of love, but that reality exists as something far greater. In chapter 1 of his Gospel, John is going to argue that love is the reason there is something and not nothing. The Big Bang, evolution, all of that occurred exactly as the scientists believe, but it did so because love was real. Okay, so ultimately the question that science can't answer is why there is something and not nothing. And some scientists say, well, then we're just going to say we don't know. Christianity takes the philosophical stance of saying that there is something and not nothing because love is real, and that therefore the best life one can live is a loving life. If you are acting with enough love for yourself to be who you truly are, and enough love for everyone else to honor who they truly are, and to care about them and to will them good, then you are living a very meaningful life, a life in line with the truth of the universe, and a life that in some way extends beyond this lifetime. That's John's philosophy. No old guy on a cloud, no banquet table in heaven. Those things are useful images, but the real reality is something far greater than any image could ever hope to capture. And so John says to all of those people who were doubting that we were talking about at the beginning of the video, God is all-powerful in that there is nothing that can be accomplished that love cannot accomplish. Now, this does not mean that God can make a square circle. Square circles cannot exist. Therefore, love can't make them. But anything that can be done through love. We can't necessarily cure a disease immediately, but the reason why we research diseases is because we care about other people. Love can also make some of the side effects of a disease, like social isolation and things like that, become less of a problem. And that's what he's saying. All-knowing. The truth doesn't need to be hidden from true love. Your human people around you, right, might stop loving you if they find out certain things about you, right? God does not. There is no escaping the reality that we are exactly who we are supposed to be, and that God is thrilled with us. Now, he's not so happy when we don't live up to who we are, but not in a sense that he stops loving us, just as in the sense that he's, disappointed. Not angry, just disappointed. The old saying. And we say that love is unending and it's present in all places. We believe that in some respect or another, even if the universe itself is destroyed, the truth of love remains. And so whenever we did a loving thing, whenever we acted again with love for ourselves or love for other people in a real way, we were actually doing something that was so significant and so important that we become more important than the very universe itself and more permanent than the very universe itself. With all that established, then, the question of who Jesus is pretty straightforward. Jesus is love showing itself into the world. Love showing itself into the world obviously would not be the type of person to launch wars and to slaughter all the Romans, as many people expected the Messiah to do. But that does not mean, of course, that this Messiah figure isn't real. John just says, you know what? Now that we understand God more clearly, we can know what Jesus was trying to accomplish more clearly also. We read through John's prologue at this point in class. Basically, if you replace the words Word, God, He, and light in all of this, then with the word love, then you'll understand it better. All things came to be because love was first. Without love, nothing came to be. The reason life exists is because love existed first and needed to be experienced, right? Love shines in the darkness, and darkness cannot overcome it. The world does not know love, right? Does not know that love is the only reason it exists, right? But it's still the truth. These couple paragraphs here are the entire Christian faith summed up in a few sentences. Now, they are almost completely incomprehensible, but what I just said is basically what they mean. We skipped a couple of things there, so I'm just going to kind of fast forward them. Don't worry about it. In the next section, we considered the different chunks of John's Gospel. The prologue, which we just considered very briefly. The book of signs, which is a book of Jesus' miracles. The book of glories, which is a book where Jesus, after the washing of the feet in John 12, Jesus starts explaining what he's really all about. And his disciples, by the end of it, get it. And then there's, of course, the crucifixion and the resurrection, and they figure it out. And then the epilogue, where John says, these things are all written in this book that you may come to believe. Just a very short bit where John explains why he wrote his gospel in the first place. So here we go. The prologue. God's word is how love shows itself. My word, in other words, my speech and my actions, are how you get to know me. Right? Because you can never get to know me by being me. Just as I can't get to know you by being you. I can't get to know God by being God. I can get to know God by looking at how God has shown itself, or himself, or whatever, into the world. So Jesus is that word. Jesus is basically the perfected version of all of us. We all love, and in so doing, bring God into the world. Jesus simply did so perfectly. That's really what John's going to say. And Jesus, right, the possibility of Jesus and the possibility of humanity, creatures capable, well, Jesus is not a creature. You get it. You get the idea. Beings capable of experiencing love and of loving is the reason there is something and not nothing. Because love existed first, and by its very nature, couldn't be alone. And so created everything, became the reason there was something and not nothing, in order that it might be experienced. Now, the signs are where we get into the tough question. When we say God is love, we feel like we've put God in a far more comprehensible form, right? It's easier to describe what love is than to describe what God is. We all know what love is. Problem is, describing love is just as impossible as trying to describe God. So, John tells the story of Jesus performing several signs, several miracles, in order to demonstrate that love has power even over the negative aspects of creation that we may not like too much. There are 7 of these stories. Each one shows Jesus having a special connection to God, the God who created everything. Okay? These are the 7 signs. Take a look at some of them. But basically, each one is going to show Jesus doing some kind of miracle. The critical thing to remember about these miracles, there are none of them that we can do. But there's always a miracle behind the miracle that we can do. When Jesus changes water into wine at the wedding at Cana, he prevents the party from ending. He keeps the community together. Communities are where love can be shown. We can't change water into wine. We can do things that keep communities together. I can't heal a paralytic. I can do things that make sure that a paralyzed person is included in society and is not isolated and marginalized. I can't feed 5,000 people with 2 loaves of bread and 5 fish, or 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, rather, sorry. But what I can do is seriously consider social structures and other things, and sort of try my best to push society in a direction where everyone gets fed, etc., etc. I can't raise the dead, as Jesus did in chapter 11. What I can do is console the living. Okay? So that's the kind of thing. Each of those signs, Jesus does something really cool, really dramatic, really cinematic, if you will, that we can't duplicate. But what he does, what's really the miracle, is the thing behind it, which we absolutely can duplicate. Another proof of Jesus' connection to God for John is whenever Jesus says the words, I am. Okay? I am is God's name in Exodus. And so wherever you see this in the Gospel of John, you can replace it with the words, love is. I am the good shepherd. My sheep follow me, right? Love is the good shepherd. You should follow love, right? I am the vine and you are the branches. A branch cut away from the vine cannot survive. Well, love is the vine and we are the branches. If we are cut off from love, we cannot live a good life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. That does not mean that that non-Christians don't go to heaven. That would be a ridiculous interpretation of it after 1960. What it means instead is love is the way, the truth, and the life. That's how we should live our lives. And no one comes to the Father except through me. No one comes to love except by being shown love first, right? All of this is about live a loving life and everything will work. You will not necessarily have the easiest life, but you will have the best, the most fulfilled, and the most meaningful life. We took a look at a few examples there too. So what we learn about Christian love, finally, is that it is freely given, that it does not need to be earned, and if it needs to be earned, then it is not Christian love, right? If it's conditional, right, then it's not Christian love. And that all love that exists in our experience is the will of love itself, okay? So when we love, whether it's, again, we love ourselves or we love one another enough to treat each other with dignity and respect, we are actually participating in God's creation of the world. So our lives are incredibly meaningful. whenever we love, we're doing something that is not just a little decision we made because, it was Wednesday morning and we were feeling kind of like happy and nice and everything, but it is in fact a participation in the very reality of the universe itself and has cosmic importance. By the way, I should throw in this video, love is a very strong word in English. For the Greeks, it would also have, and John wrote in Greek, it would also have referred to things like, the affection between friends or between parents and, parents love their children, obviously, in English too, but what is it? The affection between friends, or the affection between a teacher and their class, or between a coach and his team, or something like that. And so, read all of this through that lens. Anyway, love is freely given. It cannot be earned and it cannot be taken away because it is a fact of the universe. You can choose not to accept it, right? You can choose to say, I am not worthy of love and I am not loved, but it is still true that you are. So even if you refuse to accept it, it is still there. Okay? And a person who is truest to him or herself is one who can easily love himself and others, because we are exactly who God meant us to be. Okay? Because we are exactly who God meant us to be, when we screw up, it's okay. Right? The reason why there's evil in the world is because God can't force us to do exactly what God wants, because part of God's love for us is that we are our own people, that we are not simply little automaton photocopies of himself. We are instead beautifully created as exactly who we are. If love were forced, right, if God had to force us to do the right thing in order to love us, then God would not be love, right? If love is not voluntary, it is not love, right? It's assault at best. So there we go. We can go through life knowing that we cannot lose the one thing that matters, right? We can go through life with all love and no fear. We have nothing to fear because love itself, the only thing that matters, cannot be taken from us by any power in the world, in space, in time, anywhere else. And John points out that even death itself, right, is laughably meaningless. That's not our experience of it by any means. Death is a horrible tragedy and it really sucks to deal with, right? But John points out that death has no power over love itself, and that's what's critically important to realize. So Jesus' connection to God is proven whenever he is fearless or forgiving. Because when you're fearless, you realize that people can't take away from you anything that truly matters. And when you're forgiving, you're realizing that there's more to the person opposite you than the worst deed they ever committed, right? And so when you see people doing something bad and you let it go, you're proving that you believe in love, okay? So all of those stories about Jesus are all seeking to prove the same thing, that love has power over literally everything. Finally, there's a last little bit here where I asked you to think about the Passion story. John starts the Passion story with the story of the triumphal entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, when Jesus enters to great celebration and acclaim because people think that he is going to save them from the Romans, that he's going to kick the Romans out politically. John starts the Passion story then with a negative definition of Jesus. In other words, a negative definition doesn't mean you say something is bad. A negative definition means you say what something is not. Right? If I tell you what a croissant is, I can define it positively by saying, well, it's this bread thing that you make with butter and then you roll it up and you bake it. I can negatively define it by saying it is not a ciabatta roll. Does that make sense? I'm obviously a little bit hungry as I'm making this video. Whatever. Quickly, Jesus in John loses the support of those who misunderstood what he was there for. He loses everybody's support except the disciples within like a day. Even the disciples totally misunderstand him, right? And John's going to use the disciples' misunderstanding to further his negative definition of what Jesus is about, right? Because the disciples think that they need Jesus standing there doing his, God magic in order for them to do anything powerful. And Jesus is going to repeatedly say to them, look, it is not about my physical presence with you. It is about the fact that you learn to love. All of my power comes from love itself. That's why he says, my power comes from the Father who sent me, right? Not from my physical presence with you. And now that I've taught you all this stuff, if you live accordingly, if you live lovingly, right, you can do greater things than I ever did. So Jesus dies to set the example of how faithful they should be. But what's more important is the resurrection, which proves that love is unkillable, love is indestructible rather, it is eternal and it is everywhere. And so if we live lovingly, we don't need Jesus standing right next to us because God himself is within us. Okay? And it's always, always, always about God. John proved that Jesus had a connection to God, that it wasn't Jesus doing superpower stuff. It was Jesus doing exactly what love enabled him to do. And the message, right? A lot of people say, oh, well, the message is that Jesus is very, very godly and less human in John than he is in the other Gospels. That is incorrect. The message is that Jesus is very, very godly, and so are you. And so if you live according to that knowledge, there is nothing you cannot do. Okay? If you live lovingly, there is nothing you will do that is there is nothing you will attempt that is impossible, and there is nothing you can do that is not unbelievably meaningful in a way beyond the significance of the entire universe itself, which is really a beautiful message, right? It says that human life matters tremendously. Now, the next few pages I also axed. I think it was page 14 and 15 that I took out completely. Pages 16 and 17 of the packet were your review sheet. Make sure you do that. You should be good for this test. It's pretty straightforward. Thanks for listening, guys.